On this video, we're trying to link two parts of the course, externalities and government intervention in markets, because obviously if there is a problem in a market failure, the government tries to do something about it often, and sometimes it gets it right and sometimes it gets it wrong. So with negative externalities, the problem is that the free market left to itself would be producing too many goods. They'll be producing QF goods. Society would like us to produce QS goods. So our aim is to get QF as close as possible to QS as we can. Now, frequently the policies involve internalizing the externality to make the decision maker think, not necessarily explicitly, but think about the externality so they actually produce or consume less of something. Now, with all of the measures that we're going to be looking at, one way of getting some marks is by looking at the possibility of government failure. Now, government failure is where the government intervenes to deal with a market failure, but actually finishes up making the problem worse. Looking at that diagram, if you look at the upper QG, that's where the government has introduced a policy that's trying to reduce production, but it's actually managed to increase production. This is often due to unintended consequences. If you look at the lower QG point, you can see they've been able to reduce production, but they've overdone it, and that gap between QF and QS, once the new policy is introduced, you'll notice that gap is bigger. So rather than having a gap of overproduction, we've overdone it, and now we've got a gap of underproduction, and that is normally due to not particularly understanding the market. We've talked about the fact that measuring the externality is difficult. Also, things like measuring the shape of that demand curve is actually difficult in practice, so the government might simply get it wrong. One potential example of that would be when the congestion charge was brought in. It was done to try to stop cars coming into London. This is the suggestion that actually stopped too many cars and lorries coming into London, and so there was a bigger negative impact on the London economy than the impact that we had from congestion. So the measure that almost everyone thinks of in an exam to deal with a negative externality is an indirect tax. You'll notice that the goods with the biggest negative externalities, cigarettes, alcohol, petrol, are those that will have the biggest indirect tax placed upon them. So there we are trying to internalize the externality. What does an indirect tax do? It drives up the price. That means that when you make the decision as to whether you want to buy a box of 20 fags or not, you're indirectly thinking about the negative externality, because the price is going to be higher and you are going to be consuming less. So the dangers, the evaluation for an indirect tax is that if the price is too high, then you're going to be encouraging smuggling into the country, or a secondary or black market or grey market emerging. Another market measure, this time to try to reduce demand, is by subsidising a better alternative, for example, green energy. If we subsidise green energy, that makes it cheaper. Consumers are going to buy more green energy, which means they're going to buy less carbon-based energy. Now, the negative there is that the money spent on the subsidy could be used to spend something else. You'll notice with an indirect tax, it actually brings in money to the government that they could potentially use, say, with say smoking duty. They could use that to finance the health service or finance an anti-smoking campaign. With subsidies, you're actually spending money that could potentially be used elsewhere. We could, if we regard the negative externality as being sufficiently big, simply ban it. So we impose a law, it's a non-market measure that prevents a legal market from emerging. Obvious examples there, cannabis or heroin. However, the fact that the government has banned these things doesn't mean that people don't consume them. Price is going to be higher because the supply is going to be restricted, and who benefits from that? Well, not the government, it's going to be the drug dealers. You're going to have a secondary market emerging, and of course, because it's illegal, you've got the additional cost of trying to police the entire thing. So particularly with things like cannabis, what some countries have gone down the route of is by legalizing it, but then slapping a massive rate tax on it. Another non-market measure could be to impose regulations or restrictions on the good. For example, there's a limit on what age you're legally allowed to buy booze or cigarettes. Of course, what some people are going to do is they're going to get people in the legal age to do it for them, or advertising bans on cigarettes or sponsorship bans on cigarettes. Again, same possible dangers. You've got the secondary market emerging, you've got the cost of policing those regulations, and the fact that traffickers benefit from the price rise. Another non-market measure is to impose a quota, which is a physical limit on the number of goods you are allowed to produce. For example, with fishing, there are fishing quotas. There was a lot of discussion about this during the Brexit negotiations. Now, a relatively straightforward diagram to show this is this one. So you can see the government has imposed a quota shown by that pink line. So though the free market would like to produce QF, it actually is only allowed to produce QS. That, of course, will drive up the price. So the negative impacts, well, of course, if the price goes up, supply curve tells you that firms are going to want to supply more. So they're going to be producing illegally, smuggling it into the country, that sort of thing. And also the problem is that fish, the last time I looked, were pretty stupid. So though there might be a limit on the quantity that's allowed to be caught, they don't know when they are hauled out of the sea whether they are below the quota or above the quota. The result of that is that dead fish, i.e. fish that have been killed as a result of them being fished, are put back into the ocean because fisher people are not allowed to actually land them, which is pretty stupid really, because that doesn't solve the problem. So another solution, I'm not going to go into that in detail on this video, is to turn those quotas into tradable quotas. So now we've turned them into a market solution. So for example, with the carbon emissions markets, if you want to increase your carbon emissions, you have to buy carbon credits. And if you've got spare carbon emissions, you can sell them to firms that want more. So you're introducing a market where one didn't exist before. Government could try behavioural nudges, for example, negative advertising on cigarettes. Again, it's a non-market measure, but hopefully you're going to be reducing demand by those wonderful little things on cigarette packets. Smoking clogs your arteries, with lovely pictures of how that might affect your toes or your lungs, that should hopefully discourage consumption. And finally, another market solution used in the motoring industry, London was the first country in the world to do this, was to introduce a congestion charge. So again, you're internalising the externality. You are making people pay for the privilege of clogging up the streets or choosing not to. So you are making them think about, via their wallet, the impact of making that decision. And I think that's enough for one video.